The woman from the hospital billing department called on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing quarterly earnings reports. She asked if I was Marcus Holloway. I said yes. She said they needed my father, David Holloway, to sign authorization forms for a procedure scheduled next week. She said they'd been trying to reach him directly but hadn't gotten a response. I told her my father died 8 months ago. There was a pause. I heard keyboard clicking. Then she said, "I'm sorry, that's not what our records show. We have him listed as an active patient. He had an appointment 3 days ago." I said, "That's impossible." I watched them lower his coffin into the ground. She said, "Can you hold, please?" She put me on hold for 4 minutes. When she came back, her tone had changed. She said, "Mr. Holloway, I'm transferring you to our patient services coordinator. There seems to be a discrepancy." The coordinator's name was Linda. She asked me to verify my relationship to David Holloway and my father's date of birth. I gave her both. She said, "According to our system, David Holloway was seen by Dr. Patricia Neville on Friday for a follow-up related to ongoing cardiac care. The appointment was kept. The patient signed in." I said, "Who signed in?" She said, "It says David Holloway. The signature is on file." I said, "Can you send me a copy?" She hesitated. "I'll need to verify authorization first. Can you provide a death certificate?" I said I'd send it immediately. I hung up and sat at my desk, staring at the wall. I was 43 years old, director of operations for a mid-sized pharmaceutical distributor. I lived alone in a condo downtown, had been divorced for 5 years, no children. My life was predictable, methodical, exactly how I'd built it after years of chaos growing up. My father had died of a heart attack in February. Sudden, massive, fatal. He'd collapsed in his kitchen. The neighbor had found him. I'd flown back to Ohio, made the arrangements, held a small funeral. We'd buried him in the family plot next to my mother, who'd passed 12 years earlier. I'd gone through his estate, modest savings, the house, a few personal items. Everything had been straightforward. I was the executor, the sole heir. My only sibling, my older sister Claire, had moved to Seattle 15 years ago and barely kept in touch. She hadn't even come to the funeral. I scanned the death certificate and emailed it to Linda. She called me back an hour later. She said, "I've reviewed the document. I'm flagging this account for investigation. But I need to tell you, the appointment on Friday wasn't the first. Your father has been seen by Dr. Neville 4 times in the past 6 months." I said, "That's after he died." She said, "Yes." I said, "Can I see the medical records?" She said, "You'll need a court order or proof that you're the legal representative of the estate." I already was. I sent her the executor documents. She said she'd forward everything within 48 hours. The records arrived 2 days later. They detailed 4 appointments between March and October, 3 months after my father's death, and as recently as last week. Each visit was logged under his name, his date of birth, his social security number. Each one included notations from Dr. Neville about his cardiac condition, medication adjustments, blood pressure readings. At the bottom of each file was a scanned signature, David Holloway. The handwriting looked like his. I called Dr. Neville's office. The receptionist said the doctor couldn't discuss patients without consent. I explained the situation, that the patient in question was deceased, that someone was using his identity. She said she'd pass the message along. Dr. Neville called me herself that evening. She was in her 50s, calm, professional. She said, "Mr. Holloway, I've reviewed your father's chart. I've been treating him since March for hypertension and arrhythmia. I saw him last week. He was responsive, alert, and in stable condition." I said, "You saw someone. It wasn't my father." She said, "The man I saw matched the photo ID on file. He knew his medical history. He responded appropriately to questions about his medications." I said, "Do you have security footage?" She said, "I can request it from the clinic, but that will take time. In the meantime, I'm required to report this as possible identity fraud." I said, "Do that." I hired a private investigator the next day. His name was Tom Landry, a former police detective who'd gone private after 20 years on the force. I met him at his office and showed him everything. The death certificate, the medical records, the appointment logs. He said, "Someone's been impersonating your father for months. The question is why. I said, insurance fraud. He said, possibly. But usually insurance fraud doesn't involve showing up in person. You file false claims remotely. This is riskier. I said, then what's the motive? He said, that's what we need to find out. Tom started pulling footage from the clinic. It took a week, but he got it. He called me in to watch. The video showed a man in his late 60s, gray-haired, average build, wearing glasses. He checked in at the front desk, signed the clipboard, and sat in the waiting room. The footage was grainy, but clear enough. I didn't recognize him. Tom froze the frame. He said, "That's not your father." I said, "No." He said, "But he signed your father's name." I said, "How did he get access to his information?" Tom said, "That's the key question. He ran the man's image through facial recognition software and came up empty. No criminal record, no public database match. He looked into my father's background, employment history, financial records, associates. He found something. In the year before my father died, he'd taken out a life insurance policy. $50,000, naming me as the sole beneficiary. I'd known about it. I'd received the payout after he died. But what I hadn't known was that there had been a second policy. Tom found records of a second life insurance application filed under my father's name 3 months after he died. The beneficiary listed was Claire Holloway, my sister. The policy was for $100,000. I called Claire for the first time in 8 months. She answered on the third ring, suspicious. We hadn't spoken since I'd told her about the funeral. I said, "Did you take out a life insurance policy on Dad?" She said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "A policy in his name, listing you as the beneficiary, filed in May." She said, "I didn't file anything." I said, "Someone did." She was quiet. Then she said, "I haven't talked to Dad in 3 years. I didn't even come to the funeral. Why would I take out a policy?" I said, "I don't know. But I'm going to find out." I gave Tom her name and told him to check her background. He called me back 2 days later. He said, "Your sister didn't file the policy, but someone using her information did. The applications were submitted electronically. The signatures were forged." I said, "So someone's using both their identities." He said, "And they needed your father alive, on paper, to keep the fraud going." I said, "Who benefits?" Tom said, "Whoever's maintaining access to the policies and the medical records. We need to find out who that is." We filed a fraud report with the insurance company. They opened an investigation. They requested documentation, signatures, and transaction histories. It took 3 weeks, but they traced the policy payments to an account registered under my father's name. The account had been opened in March. The only authorized user was listed as Helen Marsh. I didn't know anyone named Helen Marsh. Tom ran her name. She was 62, a retired medical billing specialist who'd worked at the same clinic where Dr. Neville practiced. She'd left the position 2 years ago. She had no criminal record. Tom said she had access to patient files. "She could have pulled your father's information before she left." I said, "Why target him?" Tom said, "Because he was deceased. She knew he wouldn't be checking his credit or his medical records. She could impersonate him without risk until now." We contacted the police. They opened a criminal investigation. A detective named Karen Morris took the case. She interviewed Dr. Neville, reviewed the footage, and subpoenaed Helen Marsh's financial records. They found that Helen had been collecting payouts from multiple fraudulent life insurance policies, all under the names of deceased individuals. My father was one of 6. The detective brought her in for questioning. Helen denied everything at first. Then, when presented with the evidence, she admitted it. She said she'd been desperate. Her own medical bills had bankrupted her. She'd started small, using information from old patient files to open small credit accounts. When that worked, she escalated. She'd been running the scheme for 2 years. She said, "I didn't think anyone would notice." Detective Morris said, "You stole a dead man's identity and impersonated him at medical appointments. How did you think that would go unnoticed?" Helen said, "I hired someone to go to the appointments. An actor. I gave him the details, told him what to say. It worked until someone checked. I was called in to provide a formal statement. I sat across from Detective Morris and answered her questions. She asked if I wanted to pursue restitution. I said yes. The case went to trial 6 months later. Helen pled guilty to identity theft, insurance fraud, and forgery. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution to all the families she'd defrauded. I received a check for the fraudulent life insurance payout and the costs I'd incurred investigating the case. It was more than I expected, but it didn't feel like a win. Claire called me after the sentencing. She said, "I'm sorry I didn't believe you at first." I said, "It's fine." She said, "I should have been there, for the funeral, for all of this." I said, "You had your reasons." She said, "That doesn't make it right." I said, "No, but it's done." She asked if we could stay in touch. I said we could try. I went to my father's grave a few weeks later. I stood there for a long time, looking at the headstone. I thought about the months someone had been using his name, walking around in his identity, keeping him alive on paper while he'd been gone. I thought about how easy it had been, how no one had noticed until a hospital called asking for a signature. I thought about all the systems we trust, medical records, insurance files, identity verification, and how fragile they are, how a retired billing specialist with access and desperation could unravel them. I thought about my father, who'd lived a quiet, unremarkable life, and how even in death he couldn't rest undisturbed. I didn't feel anger. I felt tired. I left the cemetery and drove home. I filed the last of the paperwork, closed the final accounts, and moved on. Helen Marsh served her time. I never saw her again. The other families affected by her fraud received restitution. The insurance companies tightened their verification protocols. Life went back to normal, quietly, the way it does. If you've ever had to fight for the dignity of someone who's gone, if you've ever discovered that the truth was hidden behind paperwork and silence, you're not alone.